Now, our next step is let's prepare our Python environment to work with this. Remember, we are going to be using Python for this project. One interesting thing on Python is that they have something called virtual environments. And this is because imagine you are working with an application, you have a library that it's in the version 1.0, you are using that in your application, and then you are interested in seeing what happens with the new version. There is a new version of this library, the 2.0, which has some cool features you want to include. If you simply update your version from 1 to 2 and that breaks your code, you need to go and fix it. And you don't have a way to, you do actually have a way to revert, but you need to go back and forth or make 2 copies of the code and then start working, and things gets a bit complicated. So Python has this concept of virtual environment, which is basically a folder containing a Python interpreter, a pip, which is used to install libraries or resources in Python. And then you have all that encapsulated in a virtual environment, like a separate thing that it's not related with your machine. So you have your Python that it's global for your complete machine, and you can have multiple small virtual environments, each one of them with different versions of the same library, and you can put your code and run the code against those environments, the same code. So you can test with different versions of the library if your code breaks or not. We are going to be doing that. It's really, really simple once you get how to do it. So what thing we are going to be doing is we go to the base. This is the way I do it. It should not be exactly the same for you, but I go here and I run Python -m venv, which is for virtual environment, and I put a name here. So I'm going to choose this one, kubefire py, and we hit enter. This is going to create a folder called kubefire_py, and we'll put a lot of files in there, right? We're going to be checking that in a moment. It finished. If we go here, we see there's this file with the include left, where we have all the packages that we already have installed. We see that there are not so many in here. And we have this scripts folder. This script folder is very important because we have this activate, which is going to tell our terminal that the Python version and the pip version we are going to be using are these ones in here, and not the global ones for our machine, right? So every time that we activate this virtual environment and we install something with pip, it's going to be installed in this folder here, in this side packages, and it's going to affect only this Python interpreter in here. So we also need to be sure that we are using this Python interpreter, okay? And we are going to configure that in VS Code. You can do this in pretty much, I think, all of the code editors. At least the ones I know, all of them support this because it's a very old feature of Python. So it's very standard. So what we are going to be doing is we are going to maximize this. We're going to be opening a terminal. And we are in here, right? So we go to this kubefire scripts, run activate. And you see now there is this name in here. This means this is the virtual environment I'm using now in Python. Something important that it's not easy to find is that in Windows you need to run deactivate, and that will remove that. So now I'm using the Python version that I have in my machine, okay? So let's activate again. And let's do something else. Before continuing, we're going to be adding here a new folder called C for source. I'm going to be adding here a main.py. In this main.py, if I do an import conf, for example, you see, I don't have a suggestion. There is no conf to install. All right, so that's fine. And we don't have linter. I don't care. That's fine because I don't have that installed yet. Also, we can see here in library that there is no conf installed in here or anything related with Azure for the case. See, there is nothing related with Azure. Now, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to run pip install, and let's install Kopf. Kopf is a framework for Python, actually means Kubernetes Operator Python Framework. It's a framework made to manage Kubernetes resources from Python. So you can actually write code in Python that it's going to be interactive with Kubernetes real time. So every time Kubernetes does something, it publishes what it's doing in an internal way that it works. And Kopf is going to be in the middle between your code and Kubernetes, and it's going to be taking care of that. It's going to be taking care of being sure that your application is aware of what's happening in Kubernetes, and that's what we want. So you see install Kopf, and a lot of things were collected and were installed. And you can see my side packages grow a lot, right? And here is the Kopf. All this is dependencies. So we can see they got installed in here. They were not installed in my machine. So if I here put import, I can now run Kopf in here, okay? This is working because I have here below my interpreter pointing to kubefire_py, right? That's because I activated the virtual environment. If this doesn't work for you, because it sometimes doesn't, you can hit F1, put Python select interpreter, and you can put enter interpreter path. It's gonna open this file. It's gonna open a folder in your machine, and then you can actually go to where your scripts folder is. Check its kubefire_py scripts, and then you select the python.exe. Right? This was done automatically for me in VS Code, but if it doesn't work for you, add it manually and it's gonna be working. The secret is that you should see this virtual environment name here, and that means it's working. The next thing we need to install in here is our SDK for Python for Azure. Why? Because this code is gonna be interacted to things that happen in Kubernetes. So something is going to happen in Kubernetes that is going to fire a function in my Python. And my Python needs to go to Azure and manage resources in Azure. So basically I need the two ends, right? The ends that connect with Kubernetes, which is Kopf, and the end that connects to Azure, which is the Azure library we are going to be adding right now. I don't exactly remember which one it is. So I did this in my previous stream. So I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna add another editor from here. And let's see what are the libraries I installed last time. Azure Identity and Azure Management Network. Yes, okay. So again, if I do here and import Azure, you see it doesn't work. So I'm gonna be here, pip install Azure Identity. Azure Identity allows us to authenticate, obviously, to Azure, yeah? And it has a very cool feature that you simply call a method called something like get credentials or something like that. And then it returns you a token in a way that you can actually use in other calls in the SDK. You simply pass that object and everything works. And the good thing about this get credential method is that it first tries to find the credentials into environment variable, which is great for pods because we are going to be passing that in that way. Then it's going to find in files in your machine. Then it's going to try to find it in your AZ CLI. And then lastly, it's going to try to find, I don't remember where, but I don't remember if it's 3 or 4 different places where it tries to find, oh, the last one is you need to provide it. So in the method. So basically there are 4 places where this method looks automatically. So if you don't pass anything, you can have either environment variables or you be logged with AZ CLI, or you can have a file in your machine, and it's going to be taking all those steps before getting the ones you put in the code. So it's really, really, really handful. So now we can see here, if we do an Azure, you see Azure, and if I hit dot, we have the identity. The next thing is the one for the firewall. So install Azure Management Network. Azure Firewall is, of course, a networking resource. So basically, it lives inside of this Azure network area, and the MGMT part is because it's management for the firewall section. So you see that it's growing a lot. You can imagine that if you don't have the virtual environments enabled, all these folders and all this code is being added into your local machine. So imagine if you're working in different projects, 2 or 3 different operators for AWS, for Google, and then for Azure, and then you have some other small projects for yourself, and you are adding all these things inside of your machine. It's very difficult to keep that updated. And also when you package your application, we are going to see that in other streams, when you package this application into an image, you want that image really, really, really small, because you are going to be running that inside the Kubernetes. So you want it to be as small as possible. Imagine if you have a lot of folders with libraries from different providers. You are running in Azure, and you have code from Google or from AWS or from something else, and that's really not useful. It's not cool. So you can have these all separated. So now we can put import in here. Import. We can put Azure, MGMT, network, yeah, and it works. So the thing I wanted to show you is this is the small code I wrote last time. This default Azure credentials is the method I mentioned before, that it's actually getting the credential for you. So later in the code, we're going to be using this credential object, and that's it. That will work flawlessly. So with that being said, we are ready to push this into our repository, right? We added some cool things. We are doing some good progress. But remember this cube file. Let's see what git status tells us. Yeah, it identifies that there is a .vs code and there is a kube file _py installing there. The VS code is basically the settings saying where is my Python interpreter. So we don't care about that. And this one, if you actually see this one, not in the script, but in the library, is huge. If I push this to the repository, it's going to take a lot of space. And every time that anyone is cloning, it's cloning all these packages. And it's not what we want. So at this point, remember we had a file called .gitignore. We never added that, but we are going to be doing that right now. So git ignore without extension is fine. And this file will contain for each line what we want to ignore. So we want to ignore the VS code because that's particularly a path in my machine. So no one cares about that. If we do a git status, we see that the git ignore was added. That's fine. We do want that in the repository, but check that the .vs code doesn't exist anymore. So Git is not looking at that file anymore. The next one is our virtual environment. So kubefire _py. And you will wonder why I don't want to push this virtual environment. If it's so important that the application cannot work without the libraries that I'm adding, why I don't want to include the virtual environment. And that's because the virtual environment, this one, is running my machine. It's my configuration of Python. So I'm running Windows. There are some dependencies that Python found because I'm running in Windows, that those are being installed inside of this lib folder. But if you are running in Mac, maybe there are other different dependencies, the same for Linux. So I don't want to transfer you the dependencies I have in Windows because those might not be working for you. So instead of doing that, we are going to be doing something really cool. If we do pip freeze, this is going to list all the packages that were installed in this virtual environment with the versions. So we see this list of things. Basically, anyone that is executing installing, sorry, all these packages and these versions is going to have exactly the same folders I have in this lib5 folder. Especially if you're running different operative systems, if you're running in Linux or Mac or Windows, the dependencies are going to be checked by your environment when you install them. But again, it's a big list, right? So taking this, it's a bit complicated. So since we are very lazy, we are going to be throwing the output into a file that is called requirement.txt. This is a historical name, so it always is called like that. And I put it into the wrong place. Yeah, here. We don't want that inside of the scripts folder. We want that in the root of the folder. Actually, we want it in any place. It doesn't care. But I normally put it together with the README and the license. And I'm going to show you later why. So if we check now, we will see that the requirements is in there and it's fine because we do want that, right? Because anyone later can do a pip install -r and pass the requirements, and this is going to install all these for you. So every time that I detect in this project or any other project that I need a new library, I'm going to do a pip install with the library, I'm going to do a pip freeze and update the requirements file, and I'm going to push these changes of the requirement file into a repository. So anyone that is cloning again the repository, do a pull, gets the requirement, do a pip install with the -r and the name of the requirement, and it's going to update their virtual environment. And I'm not passing this huge folder from the repository to the people and going back and forth with that. It's simply a text file. So this is actually the way to do it. So now we are going to add git ignore. And this is something else. I could include the two files into one commit and say a message for the two of them and say, I'm improving the code, let's say. But I can also make two commits, one for the git ignore and one for the requirements with different messages. I'm going to do that just to show that you can actually do that. So I added only the git ignore. I'm going to be putting a commit in there. And I'm going to put excluding those folders because they are only relevant to my local machine. Again, if we do status, we see the other file disappear because the commit is already in the station. And we add here requirements. Git commit. Those are the packages needed for this solution to work right now. Status again should show nothing. Status. And we do a push. Oh. Yeah. Now let's check our repository and let's see what we have in there. Yes, we have our git ignore, which if you go says is ignoring this, nothing sensitive. And we also have the requirement.txt, right? So we are fine. Now, let's see. Yeah, the source, I was wondering why the main doesn't appear in any place. And this is because, again, I created the src folder inside of my kubefile py. So it got ignored by git ignore. So we are going to pull this folder outside here. And now, if we do a status, we see the src folder in there. So we are going to be adding that. And we see that inside there is one file in there, and that's fine. So git commit. This file will contain the main code of the operator. Now only contains some demo lines. Yeah, and again we do a push. There is a limit on the length of this message. I think it's 140 characters in the command line. If you exceed that, in GitHub at least, nothing happens. You only get a message saying, oh, the message is too long, but it works anyway. So now we are gonna be coming here, and we are gonna see that we have the folder here, and we have our main.py folder file in there with our simple code. So with this, we also have our Python environment set up. So we are ready to interact with Kubernetes, and we are ready to interact with Azure in this folder and keep growing our code from here. We also set up the git ignore. We also set up our virtual environment. We are all ready to keep working. Never forget to deactivate your code so you are safe, that anything else that you do is with your Python in your machine.